The message glowed on my phone screen like a wound I couldn't look away from. Thanksgiving is family only. Don't come. My mother's words pulsed against the dim light of the control room above the grand ballroom of the Halcyon, the hotel I had spent 5 years rebuilding from ruins. Below me, through the security feed, chandeliers spilled golden light over tables dressed in cream and gold over the faces of people who had been my family, just not tonight. My mother, Sylvia Warren, elegant in her silver gown, was seated at the head of the long table, her laughter echoing faintly through the speakers. Beside her, my brother Eric poured wine. My sister Grace adjusted her bracelet, giggling at some joke. I watched them like strangers behind glass, my coffee cooling in my hands. I'd told myself I wouldn't care. I'd told myself I'd grown past her power to hurt me. But that message, those 5 words, cut through every layer of armor I'd built. Family only. Like I'd been erased. My hand hovered over the intercom, my reflection in the monitor sharp and foreign. "Cancel the private dinner," I said quietly. The line crackled. "Ma'am, that's your family's event," the manager stammered. "Cancel it," I repeated, my voice calm in a way that scared even me. 20 minutes later, the chandeliers flickered once, then went out. Through the night vision feed, I watched the scene dissolve into chaos. My mother's voice pierced through the speakers. "What's happening? Why are the lights out?" I took a slow sip of coffee and whispered to no one, "Happy Thanksgiving." The phone started buzzing almost immediately. First my mother, then Eric, then Grace. Missed call after missed call, 10:30-90. I didn't move. I just sat there, the city of Boston, glittering beyond the rain-streaked window, the hum of the generator filling the silence. I should have felt guilty. Instead, all I felt was relief. For once, I wasn't the one left in the dark. I leaned back in the chair and let the steam from my coffee rise around me. The control room smelled faintly of metal and old carpet, the hum of the servers below, mixing with the muffled sound of panic from the ballroom. I switched one monitor to the hallway camera. The banquet manager was trying to calm my mother, who stood at the center of the chaos, every inch of her authority unraveling. Even without hearing the words, I could see the gestures, the pointed finger, the raised chin, the imperious command to fix what had gone wrong. The staff looked terrified. I almost pitied them. Almost. I turned off the sound and stared at the city skyline. The Halcyon's windows reflected the lights of Back Bay, soft golden and indifferent. Somewhere down there, hundreds of people were celebrating with their families, raising glasses, laughing, forgiving each other. I'd built this hotel as a sanctuary for people like that, people who believed in belonging. My mother used to call it a vanity project, a waste of potential. She'd told me once that managing a hotel wasn't a real career, that it was service work dressed in chandeliers. Maybe she was right, but tonight those chandeliers belonged to me, and so did the silence she'd earned. My phone buzzed again. I didn't even check the name. The text preview read, "What have you done?" I smiled faintly. What had I done? I'd flipped the switch. That was all. She'd spent years pulling strings, turning family into theater, guilt into currency. Now she could feel what it was like when someone else held the controls. Through the camera, I saw Eric trying to calm her. He'd always been the mediator, the golden sun, the bridge between us. He leaned close, whispering something that made her lips tighten. Grace stood by the table, arms folded, her eyes darting toward the exit. I wondered if she'd defend me later, or pretend she hadn't been there at all. Probably the latter. Grace was good at pretending. We all were, thanks to our mother. The screen flickered as the emergency lights kicked in. The chandeliers glowed faintly, not from power, but from the candles that the staff began lighting in panic. The image was almost beautiful, chaos wrapped in elegance. I remembered being a child, standing beside my mother at events just like this, told to smile to represent the family name. "The Warrens don't break," she'd whisper whenever I cried. "We shine." But I'd learned the truth early: shine long enough under someone else's light and you burn. I closed my eyes, the bitterness rising sharp and metallic. Maybe she thought excluding me would remind me of my place. Maybe she thought I'd beg to be let back in. She didn't understand. I'd spent my whole life begging for her approval. Tonight I was done. The phone vibrated again, a relentless pulse. I ignored it until the vibration stopped, replaced by a notification. A voicemail. I pressed play, her voice spilling through the speakers, clipped and furious. "Natalie, this is childish. Whatever point you think you're making, it's disgraceful. Call me back immediately." There was a pause, then softer. "You're embarrassing yourself." I ended the message before it could finish. She always said that you're embarrassing yourself, as if shame were a language only she could teach. I switched to the exterior cameras. Outside, the valet line was filling with impatient guests' taxis, pulling up, the snow beginning to fall in small, tired flakes. Boston in November was always a study in contrast, warm lights and cold hearts. I watched the reflection of my own face in the glass, a stranger's calm smile staring back. Somewhere deep down, I wanted her to know it wasn't about revenge. Not really, it was about control. For once, she didn't have it. The radio crackled to life. "Ma'am," the night supervisor said cautiously, "Mrs. Warren is demanding to speak to management." "Do you want me to handle it?" I took a breath. "Tell her management's unavailable," I said. "We're observing the holiday." A short silence, then understood. I turned off the radio and let out a quiet laugh. Revenge didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it could be a whisper, a flick of a switch, a moment of stillness in the middle of chaos. Another notification flashed across my screen. Social media. I hesitated, then opened it. A photo already posted, my mother standing near the darkened ballroom, her expression wounded perfection. The caption read, "When your own daughter ruins Thanksgiving. Family isn't what it used to be." The comments poured in sympathy, outrage, pity. I could almost hear her voice rehearsing the story for tomorrow's brunch crowd. "She's troubled. She's ungrateful. Poor me." I set the phone face down. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd spent her whole life curating an image of grace and control. All I had to do was turn off the lights to reveal the cracks. The last of the guests began leaving, their figures moving like shadows across the lobby. I watched my mother standing alone near the front desk, her posture still regal but her expression fractured. When the camera zoomed in, I saw her glance upward toward the mezzanine, as if she could feel me watching. For a fleeting second, our eyes met through layers of glass and technology. She lifted her chin. I lifted my coffee. A silent toast to a war that had been brewing for years. When the final light went out in the ballroom, I switched off the monitors one by one. The control room fell into darkness, the hum of the servers fading into the sound of distant rain. I sat there for a long time, the weight of silence pressing in. Then I whispered, "Family only, huh?" and let the words hang in the air like smoke. Outside, Boston shimmered beneath a thin veil of snow. The streets were slick, the night electric with the hum of city life. Inside, the Halcyon stood still, its chandeliers dark, its ballroom empty, and me finally free from the illusion that I still needed her approval. For the first time, the quiet didn't hurt. It felt like power. The morning after Thanksgiving, sunlight sliced through the blinds in my office like a reprimand. The Halcyon was unusually quiet for a Friday. Staff moved through the lobby in hushed tones, pretending not to stare as I walked past. News travels fast in hotels, especially when the general manager shuts down her own family's dinner. I straightened my blazer, forced a polite smile, and headed toward the front desk where Ben, my assistant manager, was reviewing last night's damage control. "How bad?" I asked. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Ben hesitated. "We comped the guests, refunded the reservation, and apologized for the technical malfunction." "But your mother?" he exhaled. "She said she's calling the board." I laughed softly, though it came out bitter. She already did that the last time I refused her advice. Ben studied me. "You sure you're okay?" I nodded, ignoring the tightness in my chest. "I'm fine. We have bigger problems than her tantrum." But that was a lie. I wasn't fine. The truth was, I hadn't been fine for years. The blackout wasn't about electricity. It was about control, something my mother had held over me since childhood. I stood by the grand windows watching the city bustle below, and for a moment I was 16 again, sitting in her car as she lectured me about perfection. Back then, I was the golden child, straight as debate team, Captain Harvard bound. My mother's favorite accessory at charity galas wasn't her pearls, it was me. The Warrens don't fail, she'd say, adjusting my collar before an awards banquet. We lead. I'd nod because disagreeing meant hours of silent disapproval later. My father, Thomas Warren, would wink at me from the doorway, his quiet way of saying, "Don't let her win." He owned the Halcyon, then a grand aging hotel in Boston's Back Bay, filled with dusty chandeliers and fading glory. I used to wander its corridors, tracing my fingers over the wallpaper, listening to my father tell stories about every painting, every marble tile. "This place has a soul," he'd say. My mother didn't believe in souls. She believed in balance sheets. When Dad died of a stroke 10 years later, everything fell apart. I was 28, teaching economics at Harvard, living the respectable life my mother had designed for me. The call came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. By the time I reached the hospital, it was too late. She stood there immaculate, even in grief, her lipstick unbroken. "We'll sell the hotel," she said before I'd even processed the news. "It's drowning in debt." Something in me cracked. He wouldn't want that. She turned sharply. "He's gone, Natalie. We have to be practical." 2 days later, I stood alone in the decaying ballroom, the chandeliers covered in sheets, the air thick with dust and memory. The walls still smelled like his cologne, cedar, and soap. I could almost hear his voice. "Don't let her sell our name. The Halcyon is family." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I resigned from Harvard the next morning. When I told my mother, she stared at me as if I'd confessed to a crime. "You're giving up tenure for a collapsing hotel, I'm restoring it." Her laugh was sharp. "You're a professor, not a housekeeper." "I'm his daughter," I said quietly. "And this is his legacy." That was the last conversation we had that ended without shouting. She hung up halfway through my next call. My brother Eric texted me to say he understood but couldn't get involved. Grace didn't even reply. I learned quickly that independence meant isolation. Those first months were brutal. The hotel was a skeleton, leaky pipes, flickering lights, a staff reduced to 3 loyal employees who still believed in my father's dream. I slept in one of the vacant suites, living off instant noodles and black coffee. Every time I thought about giving up, I'd look at the old Halcyon logo engraved on the floor and whisper, "Not yet." The first person I hired was Ben. He was 26 then, earnest and steady. "You sure about this?" he asked when I offered him the job. "Your mother's not going to make it easy." I smiled. She never does. Months turned into years. Slowly, the Halcyon began to breathe again. Fresh paint covered the walls, new linens dressed the rooms, and laughter returned to the lobby. The local press started calling it Boston's comeback hotel. I didn't realize how far we'd come until one morning when a reporter asked for a quote from the woman who rebuilt her father's empire. That same evening, my mother called for the first time in 2 years. "I saw the article," she said. "I waited for praise. It never came." "You should have mentioned me," she added. "You didn't want your name associated with the debt," I reminded her. She sighed. "That's not the point. It looks like you're trying to take credit for his work." "Dad's work," I said, "not yours." The silence that followed was cold enough to freeze air. A week later, she gave her own interview. "It was always my husband's vision," she told the Boston Herald, her tone gracious. "My daughter helped, but she's still learning." I watched the clip on a loop that night from the staff break room, the flicker of the television washing over stainless steel counters. The headline beneath her photo read, "Legacy Lives Through Family Devotion." I laughed so hard it hurt. The next family dinner was supposed to heal things. It didn't. She invited me at the last minute, Thanksgiving Eve the year before last. I arrived wearing a simple black dress, the one my father had bought for my graduation. When I walked in, she looked surprised, as if I'd crashed her party. Eric stood to hug me, awkward and hesitant. Grace barely looked up from her phone. "I didn't know you were free tonight, my mother," said voice dripping with condescension. "I assumed you'd be working." "I made time," I said evenly. Dinner was a performance. She praised Eric's promotion at his investment firm, bragged about Grace's master's program, and glanced at me only when she needed the salt. Finally, I broke the silence. "The Halcyon's fully booked through December," I said. "We just got featured in Traveler magazine." "How nice," she said, smiling at her wine glass. "It must be lovely having so much free time." Eric cleared his throat. Grace scrolled faster. I stared at the tablecloth until the patterns blurred. The food tasted like nothing. When I left that night, she followed me to the door. "You've changed," she said. "This obsession, it isn't healthy." "It's not obsession," I said. "It's work," she smiled thinly. "Call it what you like. Just remember who you are." "I am remembering," I said and walked away. Back in the present, I sat at my desk, turning an old photograph between my fingers, me at 10 years old, standing beside my father under the Halcyon sign, his arm around my shoulder, both of us beaming. Behind us, the hotel looked smaller, almost shy, like it needed someone to believe in it again. "I did it, Dad," I whispered. "I saved it." But the image of my mother's furious face from last night pushed its way in. The blackout had been reckless, but satisfying. Still, I knew it wasn't the end. Not with her. She would never surrender control quietly. A chime interrupted my thoughts, an email notification. I clicked it open. Subject line: request for comment. Thanksgiving incident at the Halcyon. My stomach turned. The attached photo showed my mother standing outside the hotel entrance, her hand over her heart, a perfectly rehearsed expression of hurt on her face. The caption read, "Abandoned by her own daughter on Thanksgiving." The article was already live on 3 local news sites. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. She was faster this time. She always was. I scrolled through the comments: sympathy, outrage, pity. How could a daughter do this disgusting behavior? Money changes people. A bitter laugh escaped me. "She's starting the narrative again," I whispered. The same story she'd told my whole life, the dutiful mother and the ungrateful child. Only now, she had an audience. Ben knocked softly on the door. "You've seen it," I nodded. "What are you going to do?" I looked past him out the window at the faint reflection of the city below. "If she wants a war," I said, my voice steady, "she's just declared it in public." The first headline hit before sunrise: "Daughter bans her own mother on Thanksgiving." My phone buzzed so hard it rattled the nightstand. By the time I opened my eyes, Boston had already decided who the villain was. Every news outlet had a photo of my mother standing outside, the Halcyon hand pressed to her chest like a saint. "I only wanted a family dinner," she said tearfully to a reporter. "She humiliated me in front of everyone." I scrolled through the comments, my chest tightening. Heartless, ungrateful, poor woman. Each one felt like a pebble thrown through glass. My phone lit up again, unknown numbers, voicemail alerts, reporters requesting a statement. I ignored them all. Outside my window, the city woke to another gray Boston morning, but inside me, everything burned. When I arrived at the hotel, the lobby was quieter than usual. Guests glanced up from their newspapers, whispering as I walked past. A mother tugged her daughter closer when I passed the front desk. Ben met me halfway across the marble floor, his expression grim. 5 cancellations before 8 o'clock, he said. 2 suppliers want early payments. They're nervous. Because of gossip. Because your mother's gossip sells, he said carefully. I forced a smile. Keep operations normal, no statements, no interviews. He hesitated. Are you sure that smart silence can look like guilt? Silence, I said, is composure. But even as I said it, my hands trembled. By 10, the story was everywhere. A local morning show replayed my mother's interview between cooking segments and weather reports. The hosts clucked sympathetically. Family drama like this, especially around the holidays, one said. It's just heartbreaking. I muted the TV and tried to focus on the reservation logs, but the cancellations kept piling up. Guests no longer wanted to dine under chandeliers associated with betrayal. Every notification felt like another door closing. At noon, my phone rang again. Eric. I almost didn't answer. Mom's a wreck, he said the second I picked up. She's been crying all morning. What did you do to her? I gripped the desk. She told me not to come. I have the message, Eric. Thanksgiving is family only. Her words. He sighed as if speaking to a child. She said you misunderstood. You told her you were too busy working. That's not true. I can show you the text. Natalie, he said softly, patronizingly. You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you don't remember right. The line went quiet except for the sound of my own pulse. You've already chosen her side, I whispered. I'm choosing peace, he said and hung up. A minute later, Grace's message appeared. You always need to be the victim. Maybe stop making Mom the villain for once. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I threw the phone onto the couch. By afternoon, the hotel's online rating had dropped a full point. One post read, "Heartless owner ruins Thanksgiving." Another, "Won't support a business with no family values." Someone even made a meme of my mother crying under the caption, "Family only means money." Ben knocked on my office door. You should post a response, he urged. Tell your side before she buries you. I'm not feeding her narrative, I said. She's feeding everyone else's. Then let her choke on it. His eyes softened, but he didn't argue. The next blow came from the bank. Around 3, my cell rang again. Charles Denton, First Massachusetts Trust. Miss Warren, he said smoothly, I'm calling about the current loan on the Halcyon. Yes, we've received several reports regarding recent negative publicity. Given the circumstances, the board will need to reassess your credit terms. You're changing my loan because of rumors. Because perception affects business, he said, and business affects repayment. I swallowed hard. What are you suggesting? An interest rate adjustment, effective immediately. From 4 to 7%. That's extortion. It's policy. The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at my reflection in the dark computer screen. My mother had always said reputation was everything. Now she was weaponizing mine. Around 5, Mia, one of the receptionists, knocked softly. Her eyes were red. I just wanted to say thank you, she murmured. For what? For the opportunity, she said. But I can't stay. People recognize me from the news. They're saying awful things online. I nodded, too tired to argue. Take care of yourself. She smiled weakly and left. 10 minutes later, I saw her post on social media, sad to leave the Halcyon, but toxic management isn't worth it. I laughed, once hollow and sharp. Even my walls were leaking loyalty. As night fell, the hotel emptied. The lobby lights reflected off the marble floors, casting the place in ghostly gold. I sat alone in my office, scrolling through the digital wreckage of my life. The news, the comments, the hate. Then, for no reason I could name, a memory surfaced me at 17, sitting on the living room floor, writing my college essay. I'd written about wanting freedom from expectations, about feeling trapped inside perfection. My mother found the draft the next morning. She didn't yell. She simply tore it in half and handed it back to me. Never show people weakness, she'd said. They'll use it against you. Now her lesson had become prophecy. She was using my weakness against me. I pushed the memory away and reopened the hotel's security feed. I don't even know why, maybe to remind myself I still had control over something. As I skimmed through the footage from Thanksgiving night, something caught my eye. At 6:30 p.m., an hour before dinner, my mother appeared in the frame outside the ballroom. She wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, tall, mid-40s, carrying a leather briefcase. They spoke for several minutes before she handed him an envelope. He nodded, shook her hand, and walked away. I froze the frame, zoomed in. His face was unfamiliar, his presence suspicious. I printed the still image and wrote across the bottom in black ink, "Who are you?" A knock startled me. Ben again, holding 2 takeout cups. "You need caffeine," he said. "Thanks." I took one and forced a smile. He glanced at the frozen image on my screen. "Who's that? I don't know yet," I said. "But he's why she came here early." Ben frowned. "You think she planned this? She plans everything." After he left, I sat back staring at the photo. My mother had always turned emotion into performance, but this felt different, organized, rehearsed. Maybe the Thanksgiving disaster hadn't been an accident. Maybe it was step one in something bigger. The office phone rang, then sharp and sudden. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something in me said answer. "Hello?" A woman's voice, soft but urgent. "Natalie Warren." "Yes. You don't know me," she said, "but you need to hear this. I used to work with your mother." I straightened. "Who is this? She's not who you think she is. You should stop believing this is about family." My stomach tightened. "Then what is it about?" Pause. Then the voice dropped to a whisper. "It's about survival. Who are you? Call me Grace." The line clicked dead. I sat frozen, the dial tone humming like a heartbeat in the silence. The photo of my mother and the briefcase man lay beside me, edges curling in the lamplight. Outside rain began to fall against the windows, steady and cold. I turned off the lights and walked into the empty ballroom. The chandeliers gleamed again, restored, but somehow the room still felt haunted. My reflection shimmered on the polished floor, pale and unsteady. "She wanted a war," I murmured to myself. "Now she'll get one." I returned to my office and pinned the printed photo to the corkboard behind my desk. The man's face stared back at me through static and shadows. For the first time since the text message that started all this, I felt something close to clarity. My mother hadn't just tried to humiliate me. She'd been building something carefully, methodically, and I had just stepped into her trap. But not for long. The call came just after dawn. The sky above Boston was the color of ash, and the Halcyon's windows glowed faintly against the pale light. I hadn't slept. The photo of my mother and the briefcase man still hung on my corkboard, staring at me like an accusation. When the phone rang again, I half expected it to be another reporter. Instead, a calm female voice said, "Miss Warren, this is security. There's someone here asking for you. Says her name is Grace." My heart stuttered. "Send her to the lobby," I said. Grace was older than I expected, mid-50s, maybe hair streaked with silver, a soft scarf wrapped around her neck despite the warmth of the lobby. She looked nervous but steady. When she saw me, she exhaled in relief. "I wasn't sure you'd actually meet me," she said. "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. "You said you worked with my mother." She nodded and followed me into the small cafe off the main corridor. We took a corner table away from the morning guests. Steam rose between us from 2 cups of untouched coffee. "I was a nurse at the Boston Recovery Center about 15 years ago," Grace began. "Your mother was my supervisor. We worked together for 2 years. I leaned forward. "Why are you telling me this now?" Her eyes met mine, calm but heavy. "Because I saw the news, and I know what she's capable of when someone threatens her image." I sat back slowly. "You think she's behind the smear campaign?" Grace gave a small, bitter smile. "I don't think. I know. I watched her do it to others." I wanted to ask more, but something in her expression stopped me. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn folder. "I kept this for years, thinking I'd never use it. But maybe you can." Inside were copies of hospital memos, complaint forms, and a photo ID badge with the name Sylvia Warren, RN Supervisor. Grace pointed to one document, an HR letter, formal and sterile. "Following an internal review, Nurse Grace L. Madsen has been suspended for patient neglect." "I didn't neglect anyone," she said quietly. "I found your mother changing medication dosages without logging them. She said it was an efficiency adjustment. When I reported it, she accused me of stealing drugs. I lost my license for a year. She was promoted." I stared at the pages, the air between us tightening. "She ruined your life," she tried, Grace said. "But she never knew I kept copies of everything." The hum of the espresso machine filled the silence. I wanted to believe she was lying, some bitter woman chasing revenge, but I couldn't ignore the cold logic in her eyes, the weary truth that matched everything I'd lived through. "So, what do you want from me?" I asked finally. "I don't want anything," she said. "But you should know she doesn't stop when she's threatened. She finds a way to destroy you from the inside out. Be careful." I glanced out the window. Snow had started falling again, soft flakes melting on the glass. "I'm already careful," I murmured. Grace stood pulling her scarf tighter. "Not enough," she said, then handed me a small card. A handwritten phone number. "If you need to talk again, call me. And if she's working with that man, be wary. His name is David Lang. Real estate developer. He's been circling your hotel for months." I looked up sharply. "How do you know that?" Grace hesitated. "Because she did the same thing to me. She doesn't just destroy reputations, Natalie. She takes what you build and sells it." By the time I stood, she was already gone. The rest of the day blurred. Guests came and went. Ben updated me on cancellations. The staff walked on eggshells. I went through the motions, smiles, check-ins, reports, but inside I was unraveling. When the snow turned to sleet that evening, I locked myself in the office and searched the name David Lang. His company website loaded: First Lang Holdings, redevelopment and acquisition specialists. Recent projects: boutique hotels, historical restorations, luxury condos. One address caught my eye: Back Bay, Boston. A proposal filed 3 months ago for a commercial redevelopment at 42 Beacon Street, the Halcyon's address. I read the line twice, my stomach dropping. My mother wasn't just staging a scandal, she was prepping a sale. A knock broke my focus. Ben stepped in, concern shadowing his face. "You haven't eaten all day," he said, setting down a sandwich. "You look like you're planning a murder." "Maybe a rescue," I said flatly. I turned the monitor toward him. "She's working with a developer named David Lang. He's already filed a permit for this property." Ben blinked. "How is that possible? You own the Halcyon. She still has shares through the family trust. Enough to sell if the board votes with her." He swore under his breath. "You think she'll do it?" "She's already started," I said. "The Thanksgiving stunt tanked our reputation. She's driving down the value before she buys us out. Cheap." Ben paced the room. "That's not just manipulation, that's fraud. Only if I can prove it." He stopped pacing. "Then we prove it." I looked at him, tired and grateful. "You'd help me do that," he shrugged. "I didn't spend 5 years rebuilding this place to watch it get gutted for condos." I smiled faintly. "Then we start tonight." We divided the work. Ben would pull internal correspondence and financial records from the shared system. I'd dig through the old family trust documents stored in the basement archives. As the hotel settled into its quiet midnight hum, I descended the narrow stairwell to the archive room. Dust hung in the air, thick and familiar. The boxes were labeled with decades of family history: tax returns, maintenance logs, faded contracts. My father's handwriting appeared on one: Halcyon Redevelopment 1999. I lifted the lid carefully. Inside were blueprints, letters, and a single photo of him standing beside my mother in front of the hotel. She was smiling then, younger, radiant. He looked proud. They both looked like they believed in something. The next box bore her name: Warren Trust Holdings. I opened it and froze. The most recent document was dated 2 weeks ago. It was a board resolution draft, unsigned, outlining a motion to transfer majority control to the trustee S. Warren for liquidation and reinvestment. 2 weeks ago. Before Thanksgiving, my pulse thundered in my ears. She'd been preparing the sale all along. The dinner had just been theater, a distraction while she moved the pieces. When I brought the papers upstairs, Ben was still at his desk, surrounded by spreadsheets. "Look at this," I said, dropping the file. She filed a board motion. "She's trying to transfer ownership to herself." He scanned the pages quickly, jaw tightening. "It's already drafted for a vote next week. She's faster than I thought. Then we have 6 days to stop her." The elevator dinged outside. I flinched. "Who's here at midnight?" Ben whispered. We peered down the hallway. Through the frosted glass, a silhouette moved toward the front desk, tall, deliberate. The night clerk looked up nervously as the man leaned forward, signed something, and walked out into the snow. I hurried to the counter. Who was that? The clerk swallowed. Delivery. He dropped this off. He held out a plain envelope, my name scrawled across the front in bold, looping handwriting. I tore it open. Inside was a single photograph, my mother in her office shaking hands with David Lang. Beneath it, a note. You can't win, Natalie. Family stays in line. Ben looked at me, his face pale. She knows you're digging. I folded the photo, my hands trembling but steadying as I spoke. Then it's time she learns I don't follow orders anymore. I walked back to my office, turned on every light, and pinned the photo beside Grace's documents. The corkboard now looked like a crime map, lines of betrayal connecting everything my mother had ever touched. Outside, the snow thickened, covering the streets in white silence. The city slept. But I couldn't. I sat down, opened my laptop, and began typing a message. To Board of Trustees, the Halcyon. Subject: emergency meeting request. If my mother wanted a quiet takeover, she'd just lost her element of surprise. The chandeliers shimmered like liquid gold above the ballroom, each crystal throwing flecks of light across the marble floor. The sound of silverware and laughter rose through the ceiling, faint but unmistakable. I stood in the control room, staring down through the glass panels that overlooked it all. My family sat at the long center table, the very place I'd envisioned my father's memorial dinner years ago. My mother had taken it for herself. Sylvia Warren was radiant as ever, her posture perfect, her pearls gleaming like tiny moons under the lights. She raised a glass, smiling to the 15 guests seated around her. To family, she said, and laughter followed. From up here, her voice filtered through the audio feed like a song I'd long stopped wanting to hear. I gripped the edge of the console until my knuckles whitened. Family, she said, in the hotel she'd told me wasn't mine to run. In the ballroom I'd restored with my savings, my sleepless nights, my sanity. Family, and not one empty chair for me. Ben's voice crackled through the intercom. Everything's ready downstairs. You sure you want to go through with this? I stared at the live feed. My brother Eric was pouring wine, my sister Grace was laughing too loudly, pretending not to notice my absence. My mother leaned toward her friends, gesturing toward the chandeliers as if she'd chosen them herself. Yes, I said softly. Let's begin. Ben hesitated. All right, we'll cut the service line first. 10 minutes until lights out. I took a slow breath, feeling the adrenaline pulse through my veins. The cameras showed waiters carrying trays of turkey and sweet potato soufflé. My mother's favorite because it was my recipe. She'd once called it cute that I cooked at all. I watched her lift her fork, the picture of contentment, while my chest burned with the heat of every insult she'd ever disguised as advice. Thanksgiving is family only. The text echoed in my head, sharp as glass. I turned up the volume on the ballroom mic. To Thomas, my mother was saying, referring to my father, her voice warm and tragic. He built this place with love, and tonight we honor that legacy together. Together. I almost laughed. I'd never realized how easily she lied until I saw it from this distance. I pressed the button. Hold the next course, I told the kitchen. Technical issue. Tell them power check in 10 minutes. The manager on duty stammered a yes. I looked down at the console, at the hundreds of blinking lights, at the tiny icons representing every chandelier, every elevator, every room. I hovered my hand over the main circuit for the ballroom, then pulled it back. I wasn't trying to destroy anything, just balance the scales. The timer hit 0. The ballroom lights flickered once, twice, then went black. Gasps filled the speakers. Chairs scraped. Someone dropped a glass. Then, through the grainy camera, I saw my mother rise from her seat, her voice sharp as a whip. What's happening? Why are the lights out? Waiters rushed to bring candles. A few guests laughed nervously. Eric tried to calm her, but she was already waving her arms. Fix it. Do you understand who I am? Her words echoed through the sound system, small and ridiculous in their desperation. I sipped my coffee, watching her lose control. For once it wasn't me she was correcting. Through another camera, I caught sight of the security guard approaching Ben at the service door. "Mrs. Warren wants to see the manager," he whispered. Ben's calm voice replied, "Tell her management is handling it." Down in the ballroom, Grace stood clutching her purse. "Maybe we should go," she said quietly. My mother snapped. "We're not leaving. This is our family's hotel." I couldn't help it, I laughed, the sound dry and strange in the empty control room. My family's hotel, the same one she'd tried to sell years ago, the same one she'd told me was a waste of my education. The emergency lights came on low and amber, throwing long shadows across the tables. The chandeliers glowed faintly ghostly, as if mocking her. "Unbelievable," my mother hissed. She turned toward Eric. "Call the owner. She'll fix this." Eric hesitated. "Mom Natalie," I said, "call her." I leaned closer to the speaker. Eric pulled out his phone, dialing. My screen lit up immediately. I let it ring. Once, twice, 15 times. I watched him lower the phone, shaking his head. "She's not answering," he said. "Of course she isn't," Sylvia muttered. "She never does anything right the first time." Her voice cut through me like a blade. I wanted to shout back, to tell her she was sitting under my roof breathing air I'd paid for, eating from plates I'd chosen. But I stayed quiet. I wanted her to stew in that darkness. The staff tried to calm the guests. Some began leaving, murmuring apologies, confusion, irritation. My mother chased after the event manager, demanding explanations. "This is sabotage," she cried. "Someone's trying to embarrass me." For once she was right. I turned off the ballroom feed, leaving only the camera above the front desk. I saw her there, arguing with the manager, her arms slicing through the air. The poor man looked ready to faint. Eric and Grace stood behind her, silent, their faces pale. "Tell her to wait," I said into the mic, my voice steady. "Technical delay. 20 minutes. The manager relayed my words. My mother's lips moved, but I didn't need to hear her. I knew what she was saying. She'd said it my whole life. "You're making a fool of yourself. You'll never be enough. You embarrass this family." Now it was her turn. I stared through the glass at the ballroom below, the soft glow of candles flickering against her angry silhouette. "Now you know," I whispered, "what it feels like to be left in the dark." The radio crackled. "Power restored in 20 minutes, Ben asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "Let them sweat a little longer." He hesitated. "You sure this is worth it?" She made it worth it. When the timer ended, I flipped the switch. Light poured back into the ballroom. The chandeliers reignited, dazzling, merciless. The beauty of it almost hurt. Guests blinked and murmured. The dinner was over, of course, the food cold. The wine spilled, the tension thick enough to choke on. The cameras caught my mother standing perfectly still at the center of the chaos, fury etched across her face. She looked up almost instinctively toward the upper floors. Straight toward me. Our eyes met through walls and screens and silence. She lifted her chin. I lifted my coffee. She turned away first. I watched as she gathered her things, barking orders at Eric, and Grace, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She didn't say goodbye to the staff, didn't look back. When the door closed behind her, I exhaled. The ballroom looked wrecked, half-eaten dishes, abandoned chairs, a few candles still burning. The perfect reflection of what we were, elegant ruins. The phone on my desk vibrated violently, breaking the silence. One missed call, then another, then another. 90 in total before I turned it face down. Outside, the city lights shimmered on the snow-dusted streets. Inside, the chandeliers of the Halcyon glowed steady and flawless, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to feel triumphant, but the victory felt hollow, cold. I'd silenced her, but the silence came with an echo I couldn't escape. For a moment, I thought about calling her, about saying something, anything, but then my screen lit up with a new notification. A photo. My mother standing outside the Halcyon, wiping fake tears with a napkin. The caption, "Family should never turn their back on family." Some people forget what Thanksgiving means. Hundreds of comments already. Heart, sympathy, outrage. I stared at it for a long time before setting the phone down. The lights glowed above me, perfect and cruel, and I whispered to the empty room, "You wanted control, Mom. You got it. But now it's my turn to hold the switch." Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the city like a lie that no one dared sweep away. By the time I woke up, the world had already chosen a side. My phone screen lit up with hundreds of notifications, articles, comments, trending hashtags. Number family only. Number Thanksgiving scandal. Number Warren drama. Every headline was some variation of the same story. Ungrateful daughter bans her mother from Thanksgiving dinner. I scrolled in silence, the coffee in my hand growing cold. The top post was my mother's. The same photo I'd seen the night before her outside the halcyon, tears, perfectly placed makeup unbroken. The caption read, "Family should never turn their back on family. I forgive her, even if she won't forgive me." 30,000 shares. Thousands of comments. Hearts, crying, emojis, prayers. A reporter on the morning news was already analyzing the symbolism of her statement. "Forgiveness in the face of betrayal," he said. "That's powerful." I switched off the TV before I threw something at it. When I arrived at the hotel, the lobby was buzzing with whispers. Guests huddled near the check-in counter, pretending not to stare. Outside, a van with a news station logo idled by the curb, the lens of a camera aimed straight at the glass doors. I walked through them anyway, my heels clicking like a drumbeat. Ben met me halfway. "You're all over the news," he said quietly. I noticed. He held up his tablet. "We've had 12 cancellations since 7 a.m. 2 wedding receptions and 1 corporate retreat. They said they don't want to be caught in family drama." I finished for him. He nodded. "We can survive it, but we need to respond. Maybe a statement. A denial. Something. I won't apologize for something I didn't do." He lowered his voice. "Then you'll let her control the story." I walked past him toward my office. "Let her have it for now," I said. "Stories change." But even as I said it, I could feel the weight of the lie. By noon, the PR firm we'd worked with during the hotel's reopening called twice, offering crisis management. They said they could craft a heartfelt apology, maybe even stage a reconciliation photo. "It'll make you both look good," the agent insisted. I hung up before she could finish. The numbers on the reservation board kept falling, 20% down by afternoon, 40 by dinner. The restaurant was half empty. Even the staff moved slower, avoiding my eyes as if fear were contagious. At 4 o'clock, I stepped outside for air. Snow drifted from the gray sky, soft flakes melting against my hair. Through the frosted windows, I could see my reflection, a woman the city thought was heartless. I thought of my father, of how he'd always told me that reputation was fragile. Once it cracks, he used to say the truth doesn't matter anymore. Maybe he'd been right. When I went back inside, Eric was waiting by the front desk. His coat was still wet from snow, his expression tight. "You've really done it this time," he said. "Hello to you too." He followed me to my office without asking. "Do you know what people are saying about Mom? She's humiliated." "She's the one who went on camera, Eric. Not me." He threw a newspaper onto my desk. The headline read, "Mother betrayed by her own child." Beneath it was a photo of her, from last night's interview, clutching her pearls, eyes glistening. "She said you locked her out of her own hotel," he said. I laughed, though it sounded hollow. "Her hotel. She hasn't worked a day here since Dad died. That's not what she told the press." "She lies," I snapped. "You know she lies." Eric's jaw tightened. "I know she raised us while you chased attention." The words hit harder than I expected. "Attention, I built this place from nothing." "She says you used Dad's death as an excuse to control the family business." I stood, heat rising in my chest. "And you believed her?" "I believe what I see," he said. "And what I see is a woman so obsessed with control she humiliated her own mother in front of everyone." I crossed my arms, forcing my voice to steady. "You have no idea what she's done, Eric." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You sound just like her." Then he turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Hours later, as night fell, the hotel was nearly empty. I sat at my desk, staring at the reservation cancellations piling in. The numbers felt like bruises, proof of how quickly love, trust, and success could vanish. An email pinged. My supplier. We regret to inform you that due to reputational concerns, we're suspending deliveries until further notice. I closed the laptop and pressed my forehead to my hands. The quiet in the office hummed like an accusation. When I couldn't breathe anymore, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The cold hit like a slap. Snow blanketed the street in a soft white hush. Across the square, the Halcyon's sign glowed faintly through the falling flakes. From this distance, the hotel looked perfect again, untouched by scandal, unscarred by truth. For the first time, I wondered if this was how my mother had always won, not by being right, but by making me doubt myself. I walked back inside, the air smelling of cedar polish and fear. As I passed the front desk, 2 employees fell silent mid-conversation. Their eyes followed me until I disappeared down the hall. In my office, the phone was blinking with a new voicemail. I almost ignored it, but something about the number, blocked and unfamiliar, made me press play. A woman's voice filled the room, soft, steady, slightly tremulous. You don't know me, but you need to hear the truth about your mother. She's not who you think she is. My name is Grace. We worked together once. You're not the first person she's tried to destroy. I froze, my hand hovering over the receiver. She did it to me too, the voice continued. If you want to understand what's really happening, call me back. Before she ruins you completely. Then the line went dead. I sat motionless, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the city beyond the window. Grace. The same voice that had warned me before, the same woman my mother's shadow seemed to follow. I replayed the message twice, my pulse quickening. What did she mean by ruins you completely? How far could my mother really go? The clock on the wall ticked softly. Midnight. I turned off the lights, but sleep felt impossible. I kept seeing my mother's face on every screen, her crocodile tears, her practiced grief. I looked up at the photo of my father that hung above my desk. You told me to stand my ground, I whispered. I'm trying, Dad, but she's burning everything. The phone buzzed again. A text, no caller ID. If you want the truth, meet me tomorrow. Don't tell anyone. Signed, only Grace. I stared at it for a long moment before typing back 2 words, where and when. Her reply came seconds later. Cafe opposite the hospital. 10 a.m. I slipped the phone into my pocket and leaned back in the chair. The city outside was quiet, muffled under the snow. If my mother wanted to destroy me, she'd have to do it face to face. I switched off my computer and whispered to the dark. You started this war, Mom. Now I'm ending it. Through the window, the Halcyon's lights shimmered against the falling snow, fragile and beautiful, like the truth I was finally ready to uncover. The cafe smelled like cinnamon and rain. I sat near the window, watching the snow outside turn Boston's streets into watercolor. Across the street, the gray bulk of street, Mary's hospital loomed through the mist, where my mother had once worked, where she'd built the reputation she now used to crush me. I checked the time again. 10 minutes past 10. I was beginning to think Grace wouldn't come. Then the door opened, and there she was. She spotted me, instantly hesitated for half a second, and then walked over. She was smaller than I expected, wrapped in a thick wool coat, her hair silvered at the edges. When she spoke, her voice carried a calm that came from years of keeping secrets. You must be Natalie. I wasn't sure you'd show, I said. I almost didn't, she admitted, slipping into the seat across from me. Your mother has a long reach. The waitress poured us coffee, and for a moment we just sat there, the hiss of the espresso machine filling the silence. Then I said, You told me my mother isn't who I think she is. Start there. Grace's gaze didn't waver. I used to work with her, at General West Medical Center. 15 years ago, I was a nurse. She was my supervisor. My stomach tightened. What happened? Grace folded her hands. Your mother was brilliant, respected. She could charm anyone, patients, doctors, administrators. But behind closed doors, she shook her head slowly. She cut corners, changed medication dosages to save money, falsified records when patients reacted badly. Everyone thought she was perfect. But I saw what she hid. I gripped my cup. You reported her. I tried, she said quietly. The morning after I filed the complaint, hospital security came to escort me out. She'd beaten me to it, told HR I was stealing narcotics. I lost my job and my license for a year. She testified against me at the hearing. Calm, professional, believable. Grace's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. She ruined me, and she never looked back. I stared at her, searching for lies, but all I saw was the kind of exhaustion that doesn't fake itself. Why tell me now? She reached into her bag and placed a thin folder on the table. Because when I saw her face on the news last week talking about forgiveness, I almost threw my coffee at the TV. Then I saw you. I remembered the look in your eyes. That's how I used to look before I learned what she really was. I hesitated, then opened the folder. Inside were photocopied memos, disciplinary notes, and an old photograph of a hospital staff meeting my mother at the center, smiling confidently, surrounded by people who clearly admired her. A memo near the bottom caught my attention. Internal review, patient case number 0427, dosage discrepancy found. Resolved under Supervisor S. Warren. She wasn't punished, I said flatly. Grace laughed low and bitter. Of course not. The hospital just moved her to another department. They said it was for reorganization. That's how she survived every scandal, by convincing people she was indispensable. I flipped through the pages. There was a copy of a letter addressed to Grace from the hospital board dated 15 years ago. As part of the confidentiality settlement, both parties agreed to non-disclosure regarding the events of February 2009. Signed this? I asked. I was 29, she said. Single mother. I needed the money. They paid me to disappear. And now her eyes hardened. Now I want her to pay. She leaned closer. She didn't just hurt me, Natalie. There were others. Patricia Moore, our old supervisor. Nathan Cole, a coworker, who caught her changing charts. Rachel Finley, her best friend at the time. She turned them all into villains the moment they questioned her. Patricia lost her pension. Nathan was accused of stealing painkillers. Rachel moved across the state after Sylvia told everyone she'd embezzled money from her. I wrote the names down on a napkin. Do they have proof? Grace nodded. Some. Patricia kept the HR files. Nathan still has his investigation report. Rachel? She recorded a phone call. I've heard it. Your mother admitting she made up the story about the theft. My pulse quickened. You think they'll talk to me? I think they've been waiting for a chance, Grace said. But you'll have to move fast. The moment your mother suspects you're digging, she'll come for you. She always does. I sat back, trying to absorb the weight of it. She's already coming for me, I said. She's working with a developer named David Lang. He's trying to buy the Halcyon. Grace's expression darkened. I know Lang. He used to manage property acquisitions for the hospital's private trust. He helped Sylvia cover the financial losses from the malpractice settlement. She kept him close ever since. If he's involved, this isn't just about money, it's about control. I clenched my jaw. She's selling my hotel to pay for her secrets. Grace nodded slowly. And she's making you the scapegoat. She did the same thing to me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The cafe had filled with soft chatter, the scrape of cups, the faint whistle of steam. Outside, a bus hissed to a stop in the snow. You know what the worst part is, Grace said quietly. People like her never think they're wrong. They rewrite the story until even they believe it. I looked down at the folder again. Each page felt heavier than paper should. I used to think she just didn't love me enough, I said. But this isn't neglect, it's design. Grace's eyes softened. You sound like your father. He saw her clearly. That's why she hated his loyalty to you. I froze. You knew my father not personally, she said. But we all knew he was the reason she stayed out of trouble. He was the one who smoothed things over with the hospital. When he died, she lost her shield. The air in my chest felt sharp. I remembered something my father once said when I was a teenager. Your mother hides truth like jewelry. When it shines too bright, she buries it. I'd thought it was just bitterness back then. Now it sounded like prophecy. Grace finished her coffee, glancing toward the window. Patricia still lives in Cambridge. Nathan's up in Salem. Rachel runs a small bakery in Providence. I can give you their numbers. But be careful. The moment you contact them, she'll know. She always finds out. I closed the folder carefully. Then I'll make sure she does, I said. Grace blinked. You want her to know. I want her to know she doesn't control the story anymore. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Then you'll need allies. Start with Patricia. She has the most concrete proof. She reached into her coat pocket and slid a business card across the table. That's my number. Call me if you need help or if you think she's on to you. Thank you, I said. She smiled faintly. Don't thank me. Just finish what I couldn't. When she left, the bell above the door chimed softly. Through the window, I watched her walk into the falling snow until her figure blurred into white. I sat there for a long time, the folder open in front of me, the papers trembling slightly in the draft from the door. The truth felt like fire, beautiful, dangerous, impossible to contain. Back at the Halcyon that afternoon, I spread Grace's documents across my desk. Each page was a piece of a puzzle I'd been too afraid to assemble. My mother's smiling face stared back at me from the old photo, surrounded by people she'd later destroyed. The intercom buzzed. Miss Warren, Ben said, your mother just arrived. She's asking for you. I looked at the papers, then at the security monitor, showing her car parked outside the lobby. She stepped out gracefully, the snow catching in her hair, her posture unshaken, as if the entire city hadn't seen through her lies. I muted the intercom. Not yet, I whispered. I opened my laptop and began typing emails to Patricia Moore, to Nathan Cole, to Rachel Finley. Each message was short and deliberate. My name is Natalie Warren. You don't know me, but you knew my mother. I need to talk. When I hit send, I looked up at the corkboard above my desk. The photo of my mother and David Lang stared back at me beside the list of names. You taught me control, I murmured. Now, I'll show you justice. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet, relentless, burying the city inch by inch. But inside, for the first time, I felt something thaw. The truth wasn't buried anymore. It was waiting to be unearthed. The night pressed against the windows, like a secret I wasn't supposed to hear. The Halcyon was quiet. Too quiet, the kind of silence that only came after everyone had given up, pretending things were fine. I sat at my desk, surrounded by papers, documents. Grace had given me the ghosts of people my mother had destroyed. The lamplight carved soft shadows across the folder labeled General West Medical Center. Confidential. 3 new emails blinked on my screen. One from Patricia Moore, one from Nathan Cole, one from Rachel Finley. Each message was short, cautious, but they all said the same thing: I'll talk. Ben knocked gently before stepping in. You haven't gone home, he said. Home feels like a trick, I murmured. He set down a mug of coffee. You're stepping into something dangerous, Natalie. You sure this is worth it? It's already dangerous, I said. I just didn't know the rules before. The next morning I drove through Cambridge under a sky bruised with clouds. Patricia lived in a cramped apartment above a pharmacy, her doorway marked by stacks of old nursing textbooks. She answered before I could knock twice. You look like her, she said quietly. Except for the eyes, yours don't hide. Inside, the living room was filled with boxes labeled HR archives and evidence. She poured tea into mismatched cups and said, I kept everything. They called me paranoid. Guess I was just prepared. She slid a file across the table. The paper was yellowed, creased at the corners. Your mother filed this complaint against me in 2007. Said I harassed her after she caught me mismanaging records. I skimmed the document. She accused you of harassment to protect herself. Patricia gave a humorless laugh. That's her signature move. She preemptively plays the victim. When the truth catches up, she's already crying for the cameras. The second folder contained emails between Sylvia and the hospital board, cold, professional, precise. Her words dripped with authority like she'd written the rules herself. She told them I was unstable, Patricia said. They didn't even check the evidence. I lost my pension, my reputation, everything. Why didn't you expose her? I asked. Because she knew how to make people doubt you, Patricia said. She didn't make mistakes, she made moves. I folded the papers carefully. She still does. Patricia leaned forward. You're her daughter. If you push her, she'll come for you harder than she came for any of us. Then she's out of practice, I said. I've already survived her once. By afternoon, I was driving north towards Salem, the sea frozen under a layer of white mist. Nathan Cole waited for me in a diner that smelled of salt and coffee. He looked tired, his face lined with the kind of fatigue you don't sleep off. You're Sylvia's kid, he asked, voice low. I'm what's left of her, I said. He gave a humorless chuckle and pulled a folder from his jacket. Then you should see this. Inside was a report signed by the state nursing board. It cleared Nathan of all wrongdoing after Sylvia accused him of stealing painkillers. They found nothing, he said, tapping the page. But it didn't matter. No one hires a nurse with a record, even if the record's false. She ruined your career, I said quietly. He sipped his coffee. She ruined my life. But I kept one thing. He slid a photocopy of a dosage report across the table. Sylvia's handwriting danced across the margins. That's her signature, he said. She changed the patient's medication and blamed me when the kid crashed. I stared at the document, my stomach twisting. This is proof. It's a start, he said. But you want something bigger. Look at who's helping her now. David Lang. He used to handle hospital properties. When Sylvia got caught, he made the evidence disappear. They've been partners ever since. The waitress refilled our cups. Outside snow began to fall again, turning the windows opaque. Be careful, Nathan said. Lang doesn't play games. He buys them. By evening, I was on the road again, driving toward Providence. The city lights glimmered against the wet pavement as I parked in front of a small bakery called Finley's Hearth. A woman with flour-dusted hands unlocked the door before I could knock. You're Sylvia's daughter, she said, without a question. I nodded. You're Rachel Finley, she smiled faintly. I was until your mother erased me. We sat at a corner table, the bakery dark, except for the glow of the ovens cooling behind the counter. She poured tea into chipped mugs and said, when she was my friend, I thought she was incredible. Charming, loyal, unstoppable. Then the audit happened. She asked me to lie. I didn't. The next week she told everyone I stole from her. I lost my business. My husband left. I moved here to start over. She reached into her apron and pulled out an old smartphone. I recorded a call. 2 years later. I just needed to hear her admit it. She pressed play. My mother's voice filled the quiet bakery, smooth, detached, almost amused. People believe what they want. I just give them a little push. Then soft laughter. I sat frozen. Hearing her voice outside my own head made it all real. Make a copy, Rachel said, sliding the phone toward me. I don't want it anymore. Thank you, I said, my throat tight. Rachel smiled sadly. She broke a lot of people, Natalie. But she didn't break you. That's why she fears you. When I returned to the Halcyon, the city was wrapped in a thin mist of snow. I spread the folders across my desk, Patricia's HR letters, Nathan's dosage report, Rachel's recording. Each document was a fragment of the woman I'd spent my life defending. The ledgers from the hotel archives sat in a separate pile. I flipped them open, scanning through months of financial records. The numbers blurred until one entry caught my eye. Large transfers listed as consulting fees paid to Lang Holdings LLC. I cross-referenced them with the trust documents. The signatures matched my mother's. She'd been siphoning money from the hotel for months. The dates aligned perfectly with the Thanksgiving fallout. She used the scandal as cover, I whispered. She's selling the hotel to pay her debts. The realization hit like cold air in my lungs. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. You used Dad's legacy to clean your mess, I said to the empty room. You always said family was everything. I just didn't know you meant everything you could sell. The intercom buzzed softly. Ben's voice came through. You still up there? Yeah, you should go home. You've been at this all day. I can't. Not yet. A pause. Just be careful. She's not going to let you do this quietly. I smiled faintly. Quiet isn't my style anymore. When I hung up, I noticed an envelope taped to my office door. Plain white, my name typed neatly across the front. My pulse quickened. I opened it. Inside was a photo, me and Grace at the cafe, taken from outside through the window. Across it in red ink, "Stop digging." I looked around the hallway, empty. Just the hum of the lights and the faint echo of the elevator somewhere below. I slipped the photo into my coat pocket. You're not scaring me, Mom, I whispered. Downstairs, Ben was closing up. He looked up as I passed. You okay? Fine, I lied. I just realized something. What's that? She taught me how to win. He frowned. What are you going to do? I smiled, without warmth. Show her what she created. In my office, I pinned the photo to the corkboard beside the files, connecting them with red string. The hospital, the trust, Lang Holdings, the Halcyon. The web of her deceit glowed under the lamplight. Then I opened my laptop and typed a new email. To Miranda Shaw, investigative journalist, Boston Chronicle. Subject: the nurse who sold her soul. I attached the documents, the photos, and the audio file. The cursor blinked. I hesitated for a moment, thinking of my father's words. Truth anchors you, it doesn't drown you. I hit send. Outside, the snow fell harder, blanketing the city in white silence. For the first time in months, I felt steady, certain. I wasn't surviving her anymore. I was hunting her. The morning light made the snow outside the Halcyon look innocent, like the world had forgotten everything. For a few hours, I let myself believe it. The dining room buzzed softly with breakfast chatter. The kitchen smelled like coffee and pastries, and for the first time in weeks, the hotel felt alive again. I stood at my office window, watching the sunlight crawl across the marble floors. Maybe I thought I'd finally survived the storm. Then Ben burst through the door, his face pale. You need to see this. He handed me his phone. A video was already playing, the image of my mother seated in her living room, her hands folded in her lap, eyes glistening. The caption at the bottom read, "A mother's heartbreak when lies destroy what love built." I want to tell you the truth, she began, voice trembling perfectly for the camera. My daughter Natalie has been spreading false documents, attacking me online. She forged signatures, created stories about my past. I don't know why she hates me so much. The screen split to show screenshots, emails I'd sent to Patricia, and the others blurred but unmistakably real. My words twisted into something ugly. She's framing me, Sylvia said softly. But I forgive her. She's unwell. My stomach dropped. The video cut to a photo of me standing outside the hotel, expression caught mid-blink, looking cold and detached. The caption, "She wants to destroy everything her father built." Ben's voice was tight. It's already viral. 40,000 shares. Number justice for Sylvia is trending. I stared at the screen, my reflection warping across it. She's fast, I whispered. She's lethal, Ben corrected. By noon, the press vans were back. Reporters clustered outside the glass doors, their microphones flashing like weapons. Guests stepped aside, whispering. One woman I didn't recognize muttered, "That's her," as I walked past. A courier arrived an hour later with a manila envelope stamped with a law firm's logo. Inside was a formal letter, defamation and fraud allegation, my name printed in bold. The words blurred as I read them. You are hereby notified that false and defamatory statements have been circulated publicly, causing reputational and financial harm to Ms. Sylvia Warren. Cease and desist immediately or face legal action. Asterisk, Ben read over my shoulder. She's suing you for telling the truth, I said bitterly. You need a lawyer. She has an army of them. He looked at me like he wanted to argue, but I shook my head. She's not defending herself, I said. She's burying me. By evening, the Boston Chronicle, my one hope for exposure, emailed to say the article was on hold pending legal review. My chest went cold. I called the journalist Miranda Shaw directly. She answered in a whisper. I believe you, she said, but my editor doesn't. Your mother's legal team threatened an injunction. If we publish, they'll shut us down. Then print it anyway, I said. I can't, Natalie. I'm sorry. The line went dead. Outside, the press lights glowed against the snow. I could see my reflection in the glass, half shadow, half ghost. At 8, Ben came in again. We lost 2 suppliers today, he said. And Mark, the events manager, quit. He said the board's getting nervous. I sat back in my chair, exhausted. She's not fighting me in court. She's dismantling me. Ben leaned on the desk. You can still fight back. With what he didn't answer. The next day, Grace called. Her voice was low, urgent. She's hired someone, a private investigator. He's digging into your past, your finances, your father's estate. She's preparing to make you look unstable. I'm already unstable, I said flatly. According to her. She's desperate, Grace said. Desperation makes her dangerous. You told me the truth would protect me, I said quietly. The truth doesn't protect, Grace replied. It exposes. You just have to survive long enough for people to see. Her words stayed with me long after she hung up. That night, the hotel felt wrong. The air in the halls was heavy, the kind of stillness that hides movement. Around midnight, Ben knocked on my office door, coughing. Do you smell that? The faint scent of burning drifted through the air. We ran downstairs toward the archives, the basement room that held decades of hotel ledgers. Trust documents, everything linking my mother to Lang. The moment I opened the door, smoke rolled out like a wave. Call 911, I shouted. Ben grabbed a fire extinguisher, but the flames were already licking up the walls, feeding on paper dust time. I rushed to the nearest shelf, grabbing whatever I could, folders, boxes, anything unburned. My lungs screamed as smoke clawed at my throat. By the time the firefighters arrived, half the room was gone. When the last flames hissed out, I sat on the cold concrete floor, covered in soot, shaking. Ben crouched beside me, holding the only box we'd saved. Everything else is ash, he said. I opened the box with trembling hands. Inside, one document had survived, the original trust contract for the Halcyon, signed in my mother's sweeping handwriting. She didn't get this one, I said hoarsely. We stood together in silence, the sprinkler water pooling around our shoes. The smoke still clung to my clothes like a warning. Later, back in my office, I watched the security footage from the basement cameras. The grainy image flickered, distorted by heat, but one thing was clear. The fire alarm had been disabled manually 30 minutes before the blaze. And just before the smoke filled the screen, I saw her. A woman in a hood, the tilt of her shoulders, the calm precision of her walk. My mother. My breath caught. She burned the truth. Ben turned from the window. Then we show them what she didn't burn. He took the box from my hands and placed it gently on the desk. We still have the documents Grace gave you. Patricia's emails, Nathan's report, Rachel's recording. That's more than enough to rebuild your case. She'll come for those next, I whispered. Then we go public before she can. I stared at the screen again. The image of her disappearing into smoke was almost beautiful in a cruel way, graceful, deliberate. I wondered if she'd smiled as the flames took everything. Ben leaned closer. She's playing a game of destruction. You play a game of exposure. Slowly, I nodded. If she wants war, she'll get it on camera. We worked through the night piecing together a digital dossier. Every email, every ledger, every voice recording. We uploaded them to cloud storage, encrypted copies in 3 different places. By dawn, the sun was rising over the harbor, the light bleeding gold through the soot-streaked windows. I pinned the burned trust document to the corkboard beside her photo. Her smiling face stared back at me, calm and unrepentant. "You wanted control," I whispered. "You taught me to fight dirty," I learned. I turned on the camera on my laptop, the red light blinking to life. The reflection of my own face filled the screen, tired, determined, unbroken. "My name is Natalie Warren," I said softly, "and this is my mother's truth." The cursor blinked on the recording window, waiting. Outside, the city stirred awake. Inside, the halcyon still smelled faintly of smoke and survival. She had tried to burn my evidence, my name, my voice, but she'd forgotten one thing. Fire doesn't just destroy, it reveals what can't be burned. The sky outside my window was still black when I hit record. The little red light glowed on my laptop screen, steady as my breath. I sat behind my desk in the same office where my mother had once lectured me about dignity, posture, and perfection. Now I faced the camera, every lie she'd told, spread out behind me like evidence in a trial. "My name is Natalie Warren," I began quietly. "You've heard my mother's story. This is mine. I told it from the beginning, the texts that excluded me from Thanksgiving, the blackout, the humiliation, the manipulation. I talked about the hospital, the lives she'd ruined, the documents, she'd burned, the fire she'd started. And then I played the recording of her voice. Through the speakers, her laughter filled the room. People believe what they want. I just give them a little push." When the echo faded, I looked straight into the lens. "This isn't revenge," I said. "This is freedom. You can't heal what you keep hiding." I stopped recording. For a moment, the silence felt like the edge of a cliff. Then I clicked upload. The video went live at sunrise. By the time I walked into the Halcyon's lobby an hour later, Ben was already waiting with his phone. 20,000 views, he said. "It's spreading like wildfire," I exhaled. "Then let it burn." By noon, the numbers had exploded. 70,000, 100,000, 200. The comments poured in. "She's brave. She's lying. She's telling my story. Families like this exist everywhere." One woman wrote, "I worked under Sylvia Warren. Everything Natalie says is true." Another, "Justice for the daughter who finally broke the silence." For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. But I knew she wouldn't stay quiet for long. At 1 in the afternoon, a notification popped up. "Sylvia Warren has posted a video." Ben handed me his phone. "Do you want to watch it? Play it." The screen filled with her face. Her hair was perfect, makeup soft, but her voice trembled just enough to sound human. "I don't know why my daughter is doing this," she said. "The documents she shows are forgeries. The people she mentions are bitter ex-employees. I have always loved my daughter. I only wish she loved me back." I almost laughed. The performance was flawless. Within minutes, the internet divided. Half the comments called her a victim. The other half called her a monster. News anchors started using words like scandal investigation and family war. Ben rubbed his temples. "We're officially trending." "Good," I said. "That means they're listening." The next day, the tide began to turn. Grace posted a statement online, confirming everything I'd said. Patricia uploaded copies of her HR letters. Nathan released his exoneration report. Rachel posted the full recording, unedited, undeniable. By nightfall, number "My Mother's Truth" had replaced number "Justice for Sylvia." A headline flashed across the TV: "In the hotel bar, whistleblower daughter exposes nurse's hidden past." I stood there watching strangers debate our lives on national television. Some voices defended her. Others demanded accountability. "She's unraveling," Ben said softly beside me. "She's finally visible," I corrected. The fallout came faster than I expected. By the third day, Sylvia's sponsors withdrew from her hospital foundation. The medical board announced an inquiry into past malpractice cases. David Lang's company faced an audit for fraudulent property transfers. An investigative report aired that evening, footage of Lang meeting with hospital executives, voiceovers, connecting him to the Halcyon's financial discrepancies. Every line led back to her. I should have felt victorious, but all I felt was empty. Watching the world dismantle her didn't bring peace. It only reminded me how much of my life she'd already taken. That night, the hotel was quiet. The city lights glowed through the snow, soft and distant. I sat in my office staring at the burnt edge of the trust document we'd saved from the fire. I didn't hear the door open until her voice broke the silence. "You've humiliated me," I turned slowly. She stood in the doorway. No cameras, no reporters, just my mother, smaller, older, her confidence fractured. "I didn't invite you here," I said. "I needed to see your face," she said, her tone sharp but trembling. "To understand how you could do this to me." "I didn't do anything to you," I replied. "I just told the truth." Her lips curled. "You think this is truth? You've ruined the family name. Your father would be ashamed." I stood meeting her eyes. "Don't bring him into this. You destroyed him long before you tried to destroy me." Her voice cracked. "You have no idea what it's like to build something from nothing to hold it together when everything's falling apart." "I know exactly what that's like," I said, "because I've spent my entire life cleaning up your messes." Her composure broke. "I thought control was love," she whispered. "I didn't know how to be anything else." For the first time, her words didn't sound like manipulation. They sounded like confession. "Then it's time to learn," I said quietly. She looked around the office, the papers, the ashes, the walls she'd once called hers. "What happens now?" she asked. "You make it right," I said. "Apologize. To everyone. Publicly." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve forgiveness." "Maybe not," I said, "but I deserve peace." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city lights flickered across her face, and in that reflection, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: remorse. She nodded once. "You'll get your peace," she said softly. When she left, I stood alone in the silence she'd never allowed me before. 2 days later, she appeared on live television. No makeup this time, no pearls. Her voice was steady but stripped of charm. "I have spent my life hiding behind a reputation I didn't deserve," she said. "I've falsified records. I hurt people who trusted me. I betrayed my own daughter to protect myself. I am sorry." I watched from the hotel lobby, surrounded by staff and guests. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then someone clapped. Then another. Ben turned to me. "You did it." I shook my head. Truth did. The fallout continued, but this time it wasn't mine to carry. The hospital board suspended her license. Lang was arrested for fraud. News outlets shifted tone from pity to exposure. The Halcyon's reservations doubled in a week. That evening, Grace, Patricia, Nathan, and Rachel came to the hotel. We gathered in the dining room, the same room where it had all begun. The air smelled like rosemary and champagne. Laughter returned to the space that had once been haunted by betrayal. "To second chances," Rachel toasted. "To survivors," Grace added. "To truth," I said. Later that night, after they left, I walked through the empty lobby. The chandeliers glowed softly, their light reflected in the polished marble floors. Outside, the snow fell in lazy spirals. My phone buzzed. A message from her. "I'm starting therapy. It's a start." I smiled faintly. "So am I," I whispered. I turned off the lights one by one until only the golden glow from the Halcyon sign remained. The city outside was still scarred from the storm, but somehow more honest for it. The truth had burned everything, but what remained was real. 3 weeks after the confession, Boston looked different. The snow had melted into silver puddles. The air carried that soft promise of renewal that comes after a storm. The Halcyon was full again, guests checking in with laughter music drifting from the piano in the lobby, and the chandeliers glowing like the heartbeat of something reborn. I stood at the reception desk, watching a couple take a selfie under the new floral arch we'd built for spring weddings. Their laughter echoed through the marble hall, the sound wrapping around me like sunlight. For months, I had lived on adrenaline and anger. Now, in the quiet peace that followed, I didn't quite know what to do with calm. Ben leaned against the counter beside me, holding 2 coffees. "You're smiling," he said. "That's a rare event." I forgot how I said accepting the cup. He grinned. "Well, it suits you." The truth was, The Halcyon had survived the storm. Reservations were up, new investors had called, and guests wrote reviews calling the place a sanctuary built on resilience. I'd started sleeping again, but my dreams were still full of smoke and echoes, my mother's voice, the fire, the words we'd both thrown like knives. That afternoon, 2 envelopes arrived. One from First Massachusetts, Trust, the other from the hotel's board of trustees. The first was simple enough, a letter congratulating me. Your account has been reinstated under standard interest. We commend your transparency and commitment to integrity. The second was heavier. The board requested my attendance at a meeting to discuss reinstating my position as full trustee of the Warren Family Trust following Sylvia Warren's formal resignation. My fingers tightened around the paper. It's not a trap, Ben said, gently reading my face. She's still my mother, I murmured. That's trap enough. He reached across the desk, tapping the letter. You earned this, Nat. Don't let her ghost keep you from what's yours. The word yours settled in my chest like a heartbeat I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, I went to see her. The rehabilitation center sat on a quiet stretch near the harbor, its windows facing the water. When I entered, I found her by the window, wrapped in a soft gray shawl, staring at the gulls above the tide. For a long moment I didn't speak. I just watched her, breathing slow, fragile, human. Finally she looked up. I didn't expect you to visit. I didn't come for closure, I said. I came for truth. She smiled faintly. Always your father's daughter. I sat down opposite her. The silence between us was thick but different this time, less like a battlefield, more like ruins after the fire. I know you told the world everything, she said softly. And I don't blame you anymore. I studied her face. You should. I did what you never could, I told the truth. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Do you want to know what I was protecting? I already know. Control. She shook her head. Fear. I frowned. Fear of what? She looked out at the water again. When your father died, his will left the Halcyon entirely to you. You were 22. I panicked. You reminded me of him, his warmth, his recklessness, his belief that love was enough to build an empire. I couldn't bear to lose everything again. So I changed the trust. I told myself I was saving the business. My breath caught. You rewrote the will, her voice cracked. I convinced the board it was necessary. Said you were too emotional, too idealistic. It wasn't punishment, Natalie. It was fear. You were everything I couldn't control. For a moment I couldn't speak. The room tilted. Years of doubt and guilt, every rejection, every cold silence suddenly made sense. She hadn't distrusted me because I was weak. She'd distrusted me because I was him. She reached for my hand, her fingers thin and trembling. I stole more than your inheritance, she whispered. I stole your confidence. Tears burned in my eyes. Then give it back, I said quietly. By letting me move on. Her lips quivered, but she nodded. You already have. When I left the center, the air felt lighter. The harbor wind stung my face, but for once, I didn't flinch. 2 days later, I walked into the boardroom of the Halcyon. The long glass table gleamed under the morning Sunday. 12 faces turned toward me, all familiar men and women who'd watched me grow up in these halls. One of them stood. Miss Warren, thank you for coming. We're here to discuss your reinstatement as full trustee of the Warren Trust. I nodded. Thank you. They asked questions about financial strategy, future partnerships, management ethics. For the first time, I wasn't nervous. I laid out a plan: community dining programs, charity events, for underfunded shelters, scholarships for hospitality students. The Halcyon would no longer be a symbol of exclusion. It would be a home for everyone who'd ever been left out of a table. When I finished, silence filled the room. Then the chairman spoke. Unanimous, he said. The hotel is yours. Ben, sitting in the back, grinned. Told you, he mouthed. As I signed the documents, my hands shook, not from fear, but from something deeper. I could almost feel my father standing behind me, his voice warm in my memory. You save people by giving them a place to breathe. That evening, we held a small dinner to celebrate. Grace, Patricia, Nathan, and Rachel came. We sat at the long table that had once hosted chaos and heartbreak. Now it glowed with candles and laughter. To new beginnings, Patricia toasted. To justice, Nathan added. I smiled. To peace. Ben clinked his glass against mine. And to you, boss. The woman who turned revenge into redemption. After dinner, I walked alone through the newly renovated archive room. The smell of fresh paint still lingered. On the wall hung a bronze plaque for James Warren, who believed warmth was stronger than control. I touched the words lightly, my throat tightening. We did it, Dad. The next morning, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope. No return address, just my name written in familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter from my mother. This was meant to control you. Now it's yours. Use it to build, not burn. Folded inside the note was a check, the remainder of her personal savings. I didn't cash it. Instead, I framed the note and hung it behind the reception desk. Every time I passed it, I reminded myself forgiveness was the hardest inheritance to keep. Months passed. The snow gave way to green. The hotel thrived. People started calling it the place that forgave. And then, one November morning, the Halcyon hosted its first community Thanksgiving dinner open to anyone without a place to go. The ballroom shimmered with golden light. Laughter filled the air. Volunteers moved between tables serving turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry pie. Ryan was there with his fiancée Melissa with her kids. Even Grace helped carve the turkey. Ben appeared beside me holding 2 glasses of wine. Full circle, he said. I smiled, watching the chandeliers sparkle over a sea of strangers who somehow felt like family. No, I said softly. Finally forward. Outside snow began to fall again, slow, gentle, forgiving. For the first time, the Halcyon didn't belong to a family name. It belonged to everyone who survived one. 1 year later, the chandeliers in the Halcyon glowed like captured stars. The ballroom was alive again. Tables dressed in gold and ivory, the air rich with the scent of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and clove. I stood near the entrance, watching volunteers light the last candles for our 2nd annual community Thanksgiving dinner. Outside snow fell in soft spirals, coating the city in quiet forgiveness. This was the Thanksgiving I chose. A year ago, I'd sat alone in the control room upstairs, watching my family laugh under these same chandeliers. I'd felt invisible, unwanted. Tonight, every table was full: locals, travelers, single parents, veterans, people who had nowhere else to go. My guests weren't bound by blood, but by the shared hunger for warmth and belonging. The laughter that filled the room sounded different than last year's silence. It sounded like healing. Grace was the first to spot me. There she is, the woman who replaced therapy with turkey, she shouted, waving her wine glass. The crowd laughed, and I couldn't help joining in. Patricia arrived next, carrying flowers. Nathan followed with a bottle of champagne, and Rachel came in holding her daughter's hand. For the first time, these people, who had once been victims of my mother's lies, were sitting together talking like old friends. Ben moved through the crowd with his usual calm, helping seat guests and balancing 3 plates at once. When he passed by, he leaned close. You realize we've officially run out of pie. That's a crisis, I said. He smiled. A good one. The jazz band started playing a soft tune, and the golden light shimmered off the glasses. I turned slowly, letting the moment sink in. For so long, this place had been a monument to power and pride. Tonight it was something simpler, purer, a home. Then the door opened. The music softened as everyone turned. My mother stood in the doorway holding a bouquet of white lilies. For a moment I couldn't breathe. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair silvered her posture, no longer commanding but careful. Conversations stilled. Even the air seemed to hesitate. I took a slow breath and walked toward her. Hi, Mom. Her voice trembled. Thank you for inviting me. I smiled faintly. Family's always welcome. Her eyes glistened. You still call me family, I nodded. We're not perfect, but we're still us. Something inside her broke, the kind of breaking that heals instead of destroys. She reached for my hand, and for the first time in years I didn't pull away. We sat together at a small table near the corner. She looked around at the crowd, at Grace and Patricia and Nathan, the very people she'd once hurt. They were laughing together, passing dishes like nothing had ever happened. "They forgave me," she whispered. "They forgave themselves first," I said softly. "That's what made it possible." Dinner went on for hours. People talked, laughed, shared stories. Sylvia sat beside Grace, telling her about the community clinic she now worked for. Patricia teased her gently. "You're finally saving lives for the right reasons." Even Nathan, once her loudest critic, lifted a glass and said, "To second chances." I looked around the room and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace that didn't need to be earned. When the last plates were cleared and the candles burned low, I stood to make a toast. A year ago, I thought Thanksgiving was about where you sit, about who invites you and who doesn't. But I learned something. It's not about the table you're left out of, it's about the one you choose to build. And tonight, this is mine. Applause filled the room. Ben raised his glass. "To the Halcyon," he said, "the only place in Boston where revenge turned into grace." Everyone laughed, and I smiled through tears. "To second chances," I said. Later, after the guests left, I helped the staff clear the tables. Ben stacked chairs while humming, and the scent of pine and wine lingered in the air. My mother approached, still holding her bouquet. "There's something I need to give you," she said quietly. She handed me an envelope. "Your father wrote this. I kept it after he died. I was too afraid to read it with you then." I opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter written in his familiar looping handwriting. "If love ever hurts more than it heals, let go. The world doesn't need perfect families, it needs kind ones. Build something honest, even if it costs you everything." Tears blurred the ink. "He always knew," I whispered. Sylvia nodded. "He believed in you before I ever did." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry it took me this long to see you clearly. You're here now," I said. "That's enough." We hugged again, and this time I didn't feel like the daughter proving a point. I felt like the woman my father raised me to become, steady, kind, and finally free. When she left, I stood in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by empty tables and candlelight. Ben walked up, wiping his hands on a towel. "You okay?" I smiled. "Better than okay. I think I'm finally home." He tilted his head. "Home, yeah," I said, looking around. "Not just this place. Me." We turned off the lights together, leaving only the chandeliers glowing softly above. The reflection shimmered on the marble floor, gold and still. I walked outside into the quiet snow, the cold air biting gently at my cheeks. Boston was silent, except for the faint hum of the city in the distance. The Halcyon's sign glowed behind me, steady and warm. I looked up at it, remembering every version of myself who had stood under those lights: the angry daughter, the heartbroken woman, the fighter, and now finally the survivor. A year ago, I wanted revenge. Tonight, I wanted peace. The snow fell heavier, soft and silver. I whispered to the empty street, "Even in the darkest night, the light still shines." Then I turned toward the camera, as if talking to someone I couldn't see but somehow knew was there. "If you've ever been left out by the people who should have loved you most," I said, "quietly remember this. You don't need their table to have a seat. You can build your own." I smiled softly, snow melting on my lashes. "Tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have forgiven or walked away?" I paused, letting the question linger like the last note of a song. Share your story in the comments below. I read every one. And if you believe that grace can be stronger than revenge, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's keep the light on for all of us who had to rebuild. Behind me, the Halcyon's lights glowed brighter, a golden heartbeat in the snow. I took one last look, whispered to the wind, "This is the Thanksgiving I chose," and walked away down the quiet street, leaving footprints that sparkled under the falling snow.